What's up, my biker friends? I'm back with another video, and today I'm going to talk about my camera setup that I use on my motorcycle. I'm going to talk about the Sony FDR X3000 and the GoPro Hero7. I have both of these cameras usually working on my motorcycle. I will talk about how I use these cameras, what I like about them, and what settings I use them in, and what accessories I use them with. Stay tuned. So let's start with my helmet camera. This is the Sony FDR X3000. It was actually the first 4K action camera that had image stabilization when it was released in 2016. I also bought the camera right when it was released, I think in the fall of 2016, which means I've had the camera now for just over 3 years. It was my first action cam that I ever got, and for a long time it was the only camera that had proper image stabilization in the 4K camera. Nowadays there's other cameras that will do the same thing, like the second camera I have, the GoPro Hero7, which now does a really good job in digital image stabilization. It also supports 4K, even does 60 frames a second, which the Sony will not do. But back to the Sony camera, why it's still my workhorse on the helmet. The major three things that I still like about the camera are the format, which is much better suited for a helmet setup than the GoPro. The GoPro works best for everything else, but when it comes to a helmet setup, the format of the Sony works much better for me. It has a much lower profile when it's attached to the helmet. I have it attached actually not with the original accessory, but I'm using something that's called Dual Lock, very similar. It's 3M Dual Lock, similar to Velcro. So it's really just Velcroed to the side of my helmet. The good thing about this helmet is, and I've done a review on the helmet right up here if you want to see it, but it actually comes with a sort of flat plate mount that you can attach any kind of camera to the side. I just use it now to Velcro my camera, and it's rock solid. It's never been loose or fallen off, anything like that. So especially when you use Dual Lock, which is 3 times stronger than Velcro, but even Velcro would probably work with a camera like this. So I really like sort of the very slim profile it has on the helmet. The other thing that I really like is the 3.5 millimeter microphone jack that I'm using. So I'm using an external microphone because the internal microphone with the wind would not work on a helmet setup like this. So I've sort of experimented with different setups. It has the 3.5 millimeter jack in there. It's nice that you can hook up microphone directly, as opposed to, let's say, the Hero, where you need an adapter to do the same thing. And it's nice to have that, but there are also issues with the setup. So it definitely, the auto levels in the camera don't know, you can't adjust them manually, so you always have a signal that's a bit too hot, so it means it's actually too loud to come in, and that kind of messes up the sound, and there's no way you can really improve on that. There's a few workarounds that I found with it to help it make it a bit better, but you could probably get much better sound of it if you had some possibility of manually adjusting it. But the good thing is you can at least use that as a headphone jack. That's a major advantage. The other advantage is the access to the battery compartment and the longer lasting batteries on this camera. I know the main reason is because it's only shooting in 30 frames per second, which allows a longer battery lifespan, but the battery lasts a whole lot longer than is on the GoPro. Now the batteries that they are 3 years old now, the extra batteries that I got, and it still outperforms the Hero with about an hour and a half of runtime, and the Hero will get me at best half an hour to 45 minutes of runtime on the batteries. So that's a major advantage of having that Sony camera, aside from the specs of having 4K and image stabilization. Let's talk about the GoPro Hero7. Now obviously this is a much newer camera. It has the latest state-of-the-art digital image stabilization, which works better than the Sony image stabilization. Also, the image quality I find to be better on the GoPro, especially when it comes to difficult lighting conditions. The GoPro does a much better job in working with darker shadows and having light backgrounds. So overall, as a camera, the Hero is probably better. Now if you want to use it with an external microphone, you have to use that microphone adapter, so you have to fiddle around with it. And like I said, one of the advantages with the Sony is easy access to the battery compartment. It's a bit of a pain in the ass with this one. You always have to take it out of that cage and then get to the battery, so it takes much longer to change out the battery. So especially if you would have that mounted to the helmet, you would always have to take the helmet down and then change out the batteries. I can change the batteries on the Sony here without even removing my helmet. I can just get it with one hand. I can flip out the batteries, and that's a huge advantage to have just from the setup. But that's just convenience overall. It's good to have two of these cameras. I had just the Sony for the first 2 years, and I would mount it in different places on the bike. Now it's nice to have one that just lives on your helmet, and then you can move around the other camera. Now let's talk about how I use this camera, or I use both cameras. Like I said, the Sony sits on the helmet. That's what it's used for most of the time. The Hero actually sits here as a default position. So I have this flexible arm. There are knockoff versions of this. Is the original GoPro accessory part. It comes with that clamp. It's sold in a set. It seems relatively expensive, especially when you compare it to some of the cheap knockoffs that you get. I bought one of those knockoffs before I bought the original GoPro part. My suggestion is don't waste your money on the cheap stuff. Get the GoPro part in this case. The clamp works much better. It's rock solid, and also that flex arm is of a little better quality. It doesn't mean it can't break. There are parts that have broken with this, but overall it's a much better setup. So the way I use the GoPro camera is when it sits on here. It's my B camera. Now I can film myself with it, with this camera, and that flex arm allows me to mount it to the front. Also, it brings it up a bit higher. So if you would have it down here, the viewing angle would be too low. So it brings up the viewing angle a bit higher. I think I found the perspective to be a bit more pleasant. But the major reason why I have this, I can actually take it off with one hand and then just kind of move it around like this. So I can, I can shoot myself from the side and move the camera around, which is a great nifty feature. So of course you have to ride it one-handed. You have to watch the traffic a little bit. There isn't much here, but the good thing is I can just slide it back in here and it's stable like this. The reason why I added this Velcro thing is because at higher speeds it starts to shake too much, and even with the great image stabilization that the GoPro offers, it's still too much of a shake. So it's sort of a second mounting option to keep it a bit more stable to the left side mirror. Now I've tried with different things. I've also used a clamp for it. There isn't a whole lot of space, as you can see on my handlebar. So I bought these GoPro mounts. These are metal mounts that you can mount where your mirrors attached to the handlebars. And I've got one of these here on the handlebar. And it is very, very rock solid, so it's easy for me to move it one-handed and then take it out and then shoot different kind of perspectives with it. Typically I shoot myself, but I can also take it off and have a second camera that can move around, which is really nice to have. Now, other camera angles that I use on this motorcycle, I have one of these mounts also up front. I haven't used that angle much, but it's permanently installed. There's a few other mounts that I use that I keep on the bike, and then of course I have that GoPro clamp that I can use and attach it to different positions. I can attach it to different bike, and it's actually quite decent. I've used all kinds of different mounts, these relatively low-priced mounts that you can sort of screw to your bike, and the problem with that is the screws just loosen up after a while and you keep losing those things. So I've got a whole range of those things that I've lost over the years. That little clamp seems to work better on the motorcycle because it just keeps that pressure when you mount it right and it won't come off. The way I use these cameras is to get different perspectives when I'm riding on the motorcycle, and not to have sort of the same helmet cam view. It's nice to have that for the onboard videos, but for some of the other stuff it's nice to have a bit more perspective, different angles to it, and the GoPro does a really good job at it. The other thing I like about the GoPro, of course, is that it has 60 frames per second, so you can slow down the video footage to get a bit of a slow motion. So I'm looking forward to the day where they have action cameras that will actually do 120 frames per second and 4K, so you can really have proper slow motion. But obviously that's doesn't seem to be around the corner anytime soon. Maybe this year they will start bringing out those cameras. One of these days that's going to happen. Now a few words on the settings and how I use these cameras and the accessories that I use with it. So as you can see, I'm using ND filters on both cameras. ND filters are basically like sunglasses for the camera. What it will do is actually slow down the shutter speed. Most of these cameras, there's only limited manual settings that you can do with it. And obviously, you can't change the aperture of the lenses. These are single focus lenses, and there's no aperturing like you would have on a SLR camera. So there are only a few ways you can control the light that comes in, and that's shutter speed, and it's the ISO setting. And the problem with that is that these cameras have such a high shutter speed in normal light conditions that you don't get the motion blur that you would normally get with your normal eye. There's a certain amount of motion blur that looks pleasant to the eye, that gives you a sense of speed when you're passing objects, and an ND filter will help with that a little bit. It's still set to automatic, but it will reduce the shutter speed enough that you get some kind of motion blur. And now you can be really scientific about it, especially with the GoPros. I think you can set everything to manual mode and set it to the exact lighting conditions. But if you're using it as I'm using it here, just on a motorcycle, you know, I'm coming from shaded areas now into sunny areas, so you have to give the camera a little bit of wiggle room to adjust the light conditions. And just having ND filters on there worked well for me. These are ND8 filters that I use as standards. I also have ND16 filters that I sometimes use on the helmet camera, but most of the times these ND8 filters live on the camera and do a really good job. So the settings that I use for both cameras is standard on the Hero. It's just 4K resolution in 60 frames per second, and I don't do any exposure compensation for that. And the Sony I also have set to 4K highest resolution. That's 30 frames per second, because I won't go any higher than that. And I have the exposure set down to -1/3, so reducing 1/3 of the stop, so getting a bit of a darker picture, because the Sony tends to blow out the highlights a little bit, so I set it to lower exposure. Okay guys, now we talked a lot about image quality and cameras. Let's talk about sound setup. Now, a few of you have asked about my sound setup on the motorcycle, how I do that, and I've experimented with different kind of setups in the past with more or less success. Like I said earlier, the Sony camera does have a 3.5mm jack to plug in an external microphone, but it also has the problems that you cannot change the input levels of the camera, which means that most of the time the signal is coming in too hot, meaning too loud, and it's messing up the sound, and there's no way for you to sort of attenuate that noise. I've played around with attenuators to actually reduce the input signal, but then there's the auto correction of the camera kicks in and still comes in too hot. So that's a bit of an issue that, you know, you could solve probably with software, but Sony has never gotten around to updating the firmware software that would allow to adjust the input level of the camera, which is really annoying, I have to say. For normal riding, I have an external microphone that I have in the rear pocket of my riding jacket, and I just run the wire internally and I just hook it up to the 3.5mm jack. That's the normal setup if I'm just recording engine sound. I have that little microphone wrapped into a bit of foam and just kind of taped it close, and that really helps with the wind noise. So it takes the microphone out of the wind. You still hear some wind noise, but for a setup that just uses the camera as a recording device, it is as good as it got with this. You can get better audio quality if you're recording your engine sound with an external recorder. That's definitely a better way of doing it, but it means you have a second device. You have to sync the device later in editing, and if you just want to flip on and off the camera and you want some engine noise in it, you will always have to use the recorder as well. Just comfort wise, it seems to be the best compromise for now, this particular camera setup. Now that I'm recording my voice as well, I actually installed an old microphone that I had from a Cardo communication system, and that's just a tiny microphone that sits now in the helmet, so I can record my voice through the helmet and bring it straight to the camera. So I've tried both of these setups and they work more or less well. Sometimes I lose sound for some reason. I don't know if the connection doesn't work so well, but most of the time it works really well. So with these two microphone setups, I can use them separately, and what I have done now in the past is I use both of those signals together. And in order for that to work, I'm using a splitter that I put into the camera, and it basically feeds one part of the signal into the left channel of the camera, and the other signal goes to the right channel of the camera. So the voice is typically recorded on my left channel, and then the engine sounds on the right channel, and that allows me later in post-production to either mix the two signals or just use one or the other. It gives me the flexibility later in post-production to use the audio and mix it in different ways. Alright my friends, this concludes my short review on my camera setup on the motorcycle. I hope you found this helpful. If you have comments, please leave them in the comment section. If you aren't already, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Ride safe.